Hey there. Welcome to another journey through the forgotten corridors of time. Tonight, we're diving into something that might just lull you into the deepest sleep of your life, while simultaneously making you grateful for every modern convenience you've ever taken for granted. We're exploring what it actually felt like to be sick in medieval times, and trust me, it's going to be a wild ride through remedies that would make your worst nightmare seem like a spa day. So get comfortable, dim those lights, maybe grab a warm drink, and let's ease into this together. Because what we're about to discover will make you realize that complaining about waiting 2 hours at urgent care is absolutely nothing compared to what our ancestors endured when they had so much as a headache. Picture this. You wake up one morning in the year 1347 with a pounding headache and a slight fever. Nothing too dramatic, just feeling a bit under the weather. In our world, you'd pop a couple of aspirin, maybe call in sick to work, and binge watch something mindless until you felt better. But in medieval Europe, that simple headache was about to become a journey through what can only be described as medical horror theatre. First, let's talk about diagnosis. There were no thermometers, no blood tests, no x-rays. Instead, your local physician, if you were lucky enough to afford one, would examine your urine. Not just look at it, mind you, but really study it. They had elaborate charts showing different colours and consistencies of urine and what each supposedly meant. Dark yellow meant you had too much yellow bile. Cloudy meant an excess of phlegm. Red tints suggested an overabundance of blood. The medieval medical world was obsessed with what they called the four humours, and your morning pee was basically their diagnostic crystal ball. But here's where things get really interesting. If examining your urine wasn't conclusive enough, they'd move on to bloodletting. This wasn't a gentle finger prick we're talking about. Medieval bloodletting involved making deep cuts in your arms or legs and letting you literally bleed into bowls while you grew progressively weaker. The theory was that illness was caused by having too much bad blood in your system, so the obvious solution was to drain some of it out. Doctors would carefully measure how much blood they extracted, sometimes taking up to a pint or more, all while you lay there hoping this medieval vampirism would somehow cure your headache. And if bloodletting didn't work, they'd bring out the leeches. Yes, actual living leeches that they'd place on your skin to suck your blood. The sensation was described by medieval patients as feeling like tiny demons were gnawing on your flesh. These slimy creatures would attach themselves to your body and slowly engorge with your blood, while you tried not to think about the fact that these same leeches had probably been used on the last dozen patients who came through the door. Now, let's say your headache persisted despite losing a significant amount of your blood supply to various medieval extraction methods. The next step would be herbal remedies, and this is where medieval medicine gets truly creative. Your physician might prescribe a mixture of crushed beetles, powdered unicorn horn, and ground up mummy flesh. I'm not making this up. Medieval Europeans genuinely believed that consuming parts of Egyptian mummies had healing properties, leading to a thriving trade in what they called mummy powder. For your headache, they might also recommend trepanation, which was the practice of drilling holes in your skull to release the evil spirits that were obviously causing your pain. Picture lying on a wooden table while someone takes what amounts to a medieval power drill and starts boring into your head, all without any anesthesia stronger than a cup of wine and maybe some herbs to chew on. But wait, there's more. Medieval physicians also believed in the healing power of precious stones. They might place emeralds on your forehead, thinking the green stone would draw out the illness. Diamonds were believed to cure madness, so they'd have you hold one while reciting prayers. Sapphires were thought to cure eye problems, so they'd literally rub the stone directly on your eyeball. The really fascinating part is how medieval people understood pain differently than we do today. Pain wasn't necessarily something to be eliminated immediately. It was often seen as a spiritual test, a way for God to purify your soul or punish you for sins. So suffering through your headache wasn't just a medical experience, it was a religious one. You were expected to bear it with grace and use the pain as an opportunity for spiritual reflection and prayer. Medieval hospitals, when they existed, were more like combination medical facilities and monasteries. You'd be lying in a long hall filled with dozens of other sick people, all breathing the same stale air, while monks or nuns tended to your needs. The smell alone was overwhelming. Imagine the combined scent of unwashed bodies, infected wounds, herbal poultices, incense, and various bodily functions all mixing together in poorly ventilated stone buildings. The daily routine in these medieval hospitals was strictly regimented. You'd wake before dawn to the sound of bells calling everyone to prayer. Breakfast might consist of thin gruel, stale bread, and weak ale. Then came the medical treatments, which could range from having various ointments rubbed on your skin to being subjected to more bloodletting or having heated cups placed on your back to create suction and draw out illness. Medieval surgical procedures were particularly harrowing. If you needed a tooth pulled, the barber surgeon would use pliers-like tools to yank it out while you bit down on a leather strap. If you had a broken bone, they'd set it without any way to see inside your body, often resulting in bones that healed crooked or didn't heal at all. Amputations were performed with saws and knives, cauterized with red-hot irons to stop the bleeding, all while you remained conscious throughout the entire ordeal. The psychological aspect of medieval medicine was equally intense. Patients were expected to confess their sins before treatment, as illness was often attributed to moral failings. You might spend hours recounting every bad thought or deed you'd ever committed, believing that spiritual cleansing was just as important as physical healing. The pressure to maintain faith and hope while enduring such primitive treatments must have been enormous. What's particularly striking about medieval medicine is how it combined genuine observation with complete superstition. Medieval physicians did notice that certain herbs seemed to help with specific ailments, and they developed surprisingly sophisticated understanding of anatomy through their limited dissections. But they also believed that the position of planets affected your health, that eating certain foods during specific moon phases could cure diseases, and that wearing amulets made from various animal parts would protect you from illness. The social hierarchy even extended into medical treatment. If you were wealthy, you might have access to physicians who had studied at universities and could afford exotic ingredients for your remedies. If you were poor, you relied on local wise women who might know which plants could ease your symptoms, but whose treatments were often viewed with suspicion by religious authorities. And through all of this, the simple headache that started our journey would likely persist, joined now by weakness from blood loss, possible infection from unsanitary instruments, and the psychological trauma of having endured medieval medical care. The cure, quite often, was worse than the disease. But here's what's remarkable about all of this suffering and primitive treatment. People endured. They found ways to cope, to heal, to continue living despite medical practices that seem barbaric to our modern eyes. Medieval people developed an extraordinary tolerance for discomfort that we can barely comprehend today. They lived with chronic pain as a constant companion, treating it not as an emergency to be solved immediately, but as a natural part of existence. Women gave birth knowing there was a significant chance they might not survive, yet they approached it with a resignation and acceptance that speaks to an entirely different relationship with mortality. The concept of hygiene during illness was practically non-existent by modern standards. When you were sick, bathing was actually discouraged because medieval physicians believed that opening your pores through warm water would allow disease to enter your body more easily. So you'd lie there, fevering and sweating, accumulating layers of grime while various family members and medical practitioners hovered around you, none of whom had washed their hands in any meaningful way. Speaking of family involvement, medieval illness was never a private affair. Your bedroom would become a gathering place for relatives, neighbors, and religious figures, all offering their own theories about what was wrong with you and what should be done about it. Privacy was a luxury that simply didn't exist. Everyone had opinions about your condition, and many of them involved spiritual explanations that required public confession or penance. The sounds of medieval medicine were haunting. Picture the constant moaning of other patients in hospital wards, the scraping of metal instruments against stone, the sizzling of cauterizing irons, the wet sounds of bloodletting, and the muttered prayers and incantations that accompanied every procedure. These acoustic memories would stay with patients long after their physical wounds healed. Medieval pharmaceutical practices were equally disturbing. Apothecaries would mix remedies in shops filled with hanging dried animals, jars of mysterious powders, and bundles of herbs whose potency varied wildly depending on how long they'd been stored and under what conditions. The same remedy might work one time and prove useless, or even harmful the next. But there was no quality control or standardization to explain these inconsistencies. Pain management relied heavily on alcohol and opium-based preparations when available, but even these were often diluted or contaminated. Most people simply learned to function through levels of discomfort that would send modern patients immediately to the emergency room. Chronic conditions like arthritis, dental problems, and digestive issues were accepted as inevitable aspects of aging that began much earlier in life than we'd consider normal today. The seasonal nature of medieval illness created its own psychological challenges. Winter brought respiratory infections that could linger for months in poorly heated homes. Spring meant the return of certain diseases as people emerged from their isolated winter dwellings. Summer brought dysentery and other digestive ailments from contaminated water and spoiled food. Fall harvest time often meant injuries from agricultural work that might never properly heal. Medieval mental health treatment was particularly primitive and often cruel. Depression was frequently attributed to demonic possession or spiritual weakness. Anxiety was seen as a lack of faith. People experiencing what we'd now recognize as psychiatric conditions might be chained, exorcised, or subjected to even more extreme bloodletting in attempts to restore the balance of their humours. The role of women in medieval medicine created additional layers of complexity. Many of the most knowledgeable healers were women who had learned their craft through generations of passed down wisdom. Yet these same women lived under constant suspicion of practicing witchcraft, especially when their treatments actually worked. The line between healing and sorcery was dangerously thin, and successful female healers often found themselves accused of supernatural activities. Medieval surgical recovery was a test of human endurance that few modern people could imagine surviving. Without antibiotics, surgical sites frequently became infected. Without proper anesthesia, patients remained conscious through procedures that would be considered torture by today's standards. Without sterile environments, complications were the rule rather than the exception. The economic burden of illness in medieval times could destroy entire families. Medical treatment was expensive, and being unable to work meant losing income at precisely the time when you needed money most. Many families faced the choice between seeking treatment and having enough food to eat. This economic pressure often meant that people worked while sick, spreading diseases and worsening their own conditions. Religious ceremonies surrounding illness were elaborate and time-consuming. Last rites might be administered multiple times if a patient seemed to be dying, but then recovered. Pilgrimages to holy sites were prescribed as medical treatment, requiring sick people to undertake arduous journeys that often made their conditions worse. The belief that suffering was spiritually beneficial meant that finding relief from pain was sometimes seen as interfering with God's plan. Medieval record keeping means we have detailed accounts of some of these medical experiences from people who lived through them. Their writings reveal a stoicism and acceptance that's both admirable and heartbreaking. They describe pain with matter-of-fact precision, noting symptoms and treatments without the expectation that relief was guaranteed or even likely. The transition between life and death was much more gradual and public in medieval times. Families would gather around dying relatives for days or weeks, witnessing the slow decline that modern medicine often either prevents or hastens. This extended process created its own psychological impact on survivors, who lived with vivid memories of watching loved ones suffer through prolonged illnesses. And yet, despite all of this primitive treatment and suffering, medieval people found ways to maintain hope, humor, and humanity. They told stories, sang songs, and created art that helped them cope with physical and emotional pain. They developed philosophical and spiritual frameworks that gave meaning to suffering and created communities that supported each other through medical crises. The contrast between medieval medical experiences and our modern expectations reveals just how dramatically our relationship with illness, pain, and healing has changed. What once required months of suffering and uncertainty can now be resolved with a simple prescription or minor procedure. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll find yourself grateful for antibiotics, anesthesia, and the simple luxury of knowing that tomorrow's headache can be cured with something as basic as an over-the-counter pain reliever. Sweet dreams, and may your worst medical experience never extend beyond a brief wait in a comfortable, climate-controlled doctor's office. Sleep was itself a medical concern in medieval times, and the experience of trying to rest while ill was far removed from our modern understanding of recovery. Medieval beds were often shared by multiple family members, meaning that when one person fell sick, the entire household was exposed to whatever ailment was making its rounds. The concept of quarantine existed, but it was primarily used for plague victims, who were sometimes sealed into their homes with their entire families, creating horrific scenes of slow death behind barricaded doors. The materials used for bedding could actually worsen illness. Straw mattresses harbored insects, mites, and bacteria that thrived in the warm, moist environment created by fevering bodies. Woolen blankets were rarely washed and accumulated months or years of bodily fluids, creating breeding grounds for infection. Pillows, when they existed at all, were often stuffed with feathers that had never been properly cleaned, leading to respiratory problems that compounded whatever illness the patient was already fighting. Medieval sleep during illness was frequently interrupted by medical treatments that seemed designed to prevent rest. Physicians believed that allowing sick patients to sleep too deeply might allow evil humors to settle in their bodies, so they would wake patients regularly throughout the night to administer medicines, check their pulse, or examine their urine by candlelight. The idea that rest was healing hadn't yet taken hold in medical practice. The sounds that accompanied medieval illness were inescapable. In shared living spaces, the groaning of sick family members, the rattling coughs that echoed through thin walls, and the constant prayers being muttered by caregivers created an atmosphere of persistent anxiety. Church bells marking the hours of prayer punctuated the night, reminding everyone that death could come at any moment, and that spiritual preparation was just as important as physical treatment. Medieval dream interpretation added another layer of medical complexity. Fever-induced hallucinations and nightmares were carefully analysed by physicians and clergy for clues about the patient's spiritual state and the likely progression of their illness. Disturbing dreams were often seen as evidence of demonic influence, requiring additional prayers, exorcisms, or spiritual interventions that exhausted already weakened patients. The role of astrology in medieval sleep medicine was surprisingly detailed. Physicians would consult elaborate charts showing which celestial bodies governed different parts of the body and at what times treatments should be administered. Certain medicines were only given when specific planets were in favorable positions, meaning that patients might have to wait days for astronomical conditions to align before receiving treatment for urgent conditions. Medieval childbirth represents perhaps the most extreme example of medical suffering that was considered completely normal. Women approached labor knowing that death was a very real possibility, not just for the baby but for themselves. The process often lasted for days, attended by midwives whose knowledge was based on experience rather than anatomical understanding. Pain relief was minimal, usually consisting of herbal teas or wines that did little to dull the intensity of prolonged labor. The postpartum period was equally perilous. New mothers were expected to remain in bed for weeks, but this bed rest often took place in unsanitary conditions that promoted infection. Childbed fever, caused by bacterial infections that could easily be prevented with modern hygiene practices, killed countless women who had survived the actual birth process. The tragic irony was that the prescribed treatment often involved more bloodletting, which weakened women further just when their bodies needed to recover. Medieval dental care deserves special mention for its particular brand of horror. Toothaches were treated with a variety of methods that often caused more damage than the original problem. Teeth were pulled without anesthesia, using crude instruments that frequently shattered the tooth, leaving infected roots embedded in the jaw. Hot irons were applied to gums to cauterize infections, creating burns that often became infected themselves. The social stigma surrounding certain medieval illnesses added psychological torment to physical suffering. Leprosy patients were declared legally dead and forced to wear bells to warn others of their approach. Epilepsy was often attributed to demonic possession, leading to social isolation and spiritual persecution that compounded the medical challenges of the condition. Mental illness was so poorly understood that families often hid affected relatives rather than seek treatment that might involve public exorcisms or accusations of witchcraft. Medieval surgical instruments were crude and multi-purpose. The same knife used to cut bread might be used to perform surgery, with minimal cleaning between uses. Saws designed for woodworking were repurposed for amputations. Needles used for sewing cloth were also used to suture wounds. The lack of specialized medical equipment meant that precision was nearly impossible and complications were inevitable. The concept of medical consent didn't exist in medieval times. Patients, especially women and children, had no say in their treatment. Husbands could authorize procedures for their wives, fathers for their children, and masters for their servants. This powerlessness meant that people often endured treatments they found terrifying or painful, with no recourse to refuse or seek alternatives. Medieval pharmacy was an art of guesswork and superstition. Apothecaries mixed compounds based on recipes that had been passed down through generations, often with ingredients that were mislabeled, contaminated, or simply unavailable, leading to substitutions that could dramatically alter the effectiveness or safety of medications. The same prescription might contain healing herbs, toxic minerals, and completely inert substances in proportions that varied wildly from batch to batch. The seasonal patterns of medieval disease created predictable cycles of suffering that communities learned to expect and prepare for. Spring brought flux and fevers as people emerged from winter confinement. Summer meant dysentery from contaminated water sources. Fall harvests brought accidents and injuries. Winter meant respiratory ailments that could linger for months in poorly ventilated homes, where families huddled together for warmth. Medieval hospitals were often the last resort for people who had nowhere else to go. These institutions were typically run by religious orders and served more as places to prepare for death than to recover from illness. Patients were arranged in large halls where the sickest lay alongside those with minor ailments, ensuring that diseases spread rapidly through the population of patients who were already weakened by their original conditions. The psychological impact of medieval medical treatment often outlasted the physical effects. Survivors of procedures like trepanation or major surgery carried not just scars, but traumatic memories of conscious pain that could trigger what we'd now recognize as post-traumatic stress responses. The combination of physical agony and spiritual terror created lasting mental wounds that medieval medicine had no framework for understanding or treating. Medieval medical education perpetuated many harmful practices through its reliance on ancient texts rather than direct observation. Physicians studied the works of Greek and Roman authors, whose theories about anatomy and disease were often completely wrong, but challenging these established authorities was considered heretical. This meant that harmful treatments were codified in medical curricula and passed down through generations of practitioners who never questioned their effectiveness. The economic impact of illness rippled through medieval communities in ways that modern social safety nets prevent us from experiencing. When the primary breadwinner fell sick, entire families could face starvation. Medical expenses could force families to sell their homes, livestock, or even themselves into indentured servitude. The choice between seeking treatment and maintaining basic survival often meant that people worked while sick, spreading diseases and ensuring that minor illnesses became community-wide catastrophes. And yet, through all of this suffering and primitive care, medieval people developed remarkable resilience and found ways to maintain dignity in the face of medical horrors that would break many modern spirits. They created support networks, developed coping mechanisms, and maintained faith in systems that often failed them catastrophically. Their ability to endure what we consider unendurable speaks to a different relationship with pain, death, and the fundamental uncertainties of human existence. As we settle into our comfortable beds tonight, surrounded by the quiet hum of climate control and the reassuring knowledge that effective medical care is just a phone call away, we might spare a thought for those countless medieval souls who faced their darkest hours with nothing but primitive remedies, spiritual hope, and the stoic acceptance that suffering was simply part of the human condition. The medieval understanding of disease transmission was both fascinating and terrifying in its complete inaccuracy. Physicians believed that illness spread through miasma, or bad air, which led to some truly bizarre preventative measures. People would carry small bouquets of herbs called nosegays, not because they smelled pleasant, but because they believed the fragrant herbs would purify the corrupted air before it entered their lungs. Wealthy individuals might burn expensive incense throughout their homes during epidemic seasons, filling their living spaces with thick, choking smoke that they believed was protecting them from invisible threats. The theory of miasma also led to some counterproductive public health measures. When plague struck a community, authorities would sometimes order all windows sealed and fires extinguished, believing that moving air carried disease. The result was stuffy, oxygen-depleted environments where people huddled together in conditions that actually promoted the spread of the very diseases they were trying to avoid. The irony was lost on medieval medical practitioners who watched their patients grow sicker in sealed rooms while attributing the worsening conditions to insufficient spiritual preparation rather than poor ventilation. Medieval physicians had elaborate theories about which types of air were most dangerous. Morning mist was considered particularly hazardous, leading to recommendations that people remain indoors until the sun had burned away the dangerous vapors. Evening air was thought to carry different types of corruption, so windows were shuttered at sunset. The air around bodies of water was suspect because it was believed that stagnant water generated poisonous fumes. This meant that people living near rivers, lakes, or marshes were constantly anxious about the very air they breathed. The medieval diet during illness was another source of prolonged suffering that seems almost deliberately designed to weaken patients further. Physicians believed that sick people should avoid most foods, particularly anything that might generate heat in the body. This led to starvation diets for patients who desperately needed nutrition to fight off infections. Meat was forbidden because it was thought to create excessive blood. Fruits were banned because their moisture might corrupt the body's natural balance. Even bread was restricted because wheat was considered too stimulating for weakened constitutions. What remained were thin gruels made from barley or oats, boiled until they had the consistency of glue and about as much nutritional value. Patients were given these watery broths in tiny quantities, often only a few spoonfuls at a time, while their bodies wasted away from malnutrition. The cruel irony was that many people probably died from starvation rather than their original illness, weakened to the point where their immune systems simply gave up the fight. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the medical nightmares of medieval times. We've witnessed bloodletting that would make vampires blush, surgical procedures that redefined the meaning of courage, and remedies that make our worst flu symptoms seem like a gentle inconvenience. Tonight, as you sink into your modern mattress with its memory foam and hypoallergenic pillows, Remember those countless souls who endured unimaginable suffering with nothing but faith, herbs that probably made things worse, and the quiet acceptance that pain was simply the price of being human. Sweet dreams, and may your deepest gratitude be for the simple miracle of modern medicine that surrounds us every day.